Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Ana Dialogue, the dialogue on analog music reproduction. Today, we have a special episode dedicated to the myths and truths of mastering. Mainly analog, but not only, also digital. And in order to do that, we need a reference. We need an authority. And I think we have the right one. Let's see who's here with us. There you are. Hello,
Good evening.
Kevin. Kevin Gray from Coherent Audio. Thank you so much for being with us here today.
My
I'll
pleasure.
put, okay, so I think we just jump in immediately with the different questions since I created so many. Might as well use our time. Okay, I think it's useful immediately to make a distinction between the concept, the meaning of mastering, between you tell us, where is the problem there?
Okay.
Sometimes
Well,
people mix up the concepts.
I totally understand. It's changed over the years. When I got
Mm,
into the business, vinyl reigned supreme. There was a cassette, but that was the only competition, and so mastering meant putting on the tape, listening to it, making any changes you think necessary, taking your notes, and then transferring that to lacquer. That was mastering. It wasn't until digital came along that all kind of changed because in the early days of CD, when vinyl was still happening, a lot of the times the mastering was done for the CD, and then the vinyl was just a straight transfer from the CD. So they'd say mastered by Joe Blow and cut by Kevin Gray, or whatever. And I think to this day there's still a bit of confusion over that. Just on Discogs last week, I saw a title that I had mastered, and it said "Mastered by the Mastering Lab, cut by Kevin Gray." Well, this was in 1975, and I can only assume that what happened was that the jackets were printed saying the Mastering Lab before it went to me. So, because Mastering Lab had nothing to do with it.
insane. And also all the concept of remastering that
Right.
I remember when I was a kid, it was written all over the place in order to push those new CDs. Well, clearly there was a remastering from the tapes.
Right.
A- And you do that as well, right? You also do mastering for digital, for CDs.
Well, actually, I don't really. I make a
Okay.
transfer to digital, either
Okay.
DSD for SACD or high res for streaming and download, at the same time that I cut the lacquer. And that's what's used in that process. But I don't actually create
Okay.
the finished digital master.
Perfect. Okay. Um, we hear a lot talking about half-speed mastering, especially in the last years. There's
Mhm.
so many releases with this nice little logo, hype stickers, and things like that. Can you tell us your opinion on this? There's actually something online. I remember where you
Sure.
answered this question, but I think it's interesting. Your
Yeah,
point of
there
view.
was there was a lot of criticism about that. I'm not a fan of half speed mastering. I think it's more of a detriment than a positive. The problem is that you're cutting all the bass in half, so you're losing an octave on the bottom, and on the top end, a
Hmm.
lot of corrective measures have to be taken in cutting to correct for things like vocal sibilance or really excessive cymbals and that sort of thing. And none of the devices that control that work with a half speed signal because it's all half the frequency. So what would be an 8K symbol is now a 4K symbol and it won't respond to it. Now, that can be corrected digitally. And so I have gone on record as saying, if you're going to cut half speed, it almost has to be from digital for it to really come out decent at all, in my opinion. I used to hear vocal sibilance and stuff on the half speed masters, and it drove me up the wall.
No, that's very interesting. For
So,
example, I did not know this, that there are these problems. And actually, I agree. I don't like that much the releases. And I also did a video where I compared older half speed masters, which were a little better, but I really don't see the positive aspect of this, except for maybe marketing, I believe. I mean, that's why we find so many
it's
releases,
it's
for
marketing
example, with.
hype. It totally is.
Mm,
Yeah, let me
okay,
just explain really quickly the way that whole thing
sure.
got started. Well, before there was enough amplifier power, because it takes one quarter of the amplifier power. It's an inverse square law thing. So you'd think it would be half, but it's actually a quarter, which can be
Hmm.
very helpful for cutting certain things. But the problem isn't as much in cutting as it is in playback. and so you can cut stuff that you can't play back. So in the mid 70s, I guess, 74, I don't know, somewhere around there, they were doing the discrete quad mastering, which put a
Mm.
30 kilohertz subcarrier on the disc, which was like an FM demodulator signal that allowed you to take stereo and turn it into a quad. And the problem was that didn't last. It didn't continue. And so JVC Cutting Center was left with a half-speed mastering system and nothing to cut half speed. And that was when Stan Ricker convinced Brad Miller to start Mobile Fidelity, and the rest is history.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you. Well, speaking about types of mastering, I was also thinking about something also I covered, but clearly with people who really are inside this type of industry know what we're talking about. We only have ideas. That's why I wanted to do this episode. I was talking about DMM, direct metal mastering.
Mm-hmm.
That's mainly used, from what I understand, at least, mainly in Europe. Is that correct, or are there some facilities in America that use it today?
The only people in the United States that have DMM are the Scientologists. They're doing their own
Oh, huh.
things using DMM. All of the systems that were set up for doing half speed, for doing DMM in the US got converted back over to cutting for lacquer. So yeah, GZ, I think in the Czech Republic, is probably the main one doing DMM now.
What do you think of
Not
that
a big fan.
technique? Not a big fan.
Well, it has a
Okay.
lot of limitations too. The groove can't be as deep as it is on lacquer mastering, for a record, and so it generally requires panning the sides in to keep it from getting too deep. It generally requires an extreme low frequency roll off, and there's just other problems with it.
Hmm.
I can usually hear it on a recording. To me, it has, if you'll forgive the expression, sort of a digital sound. Um,
Hmm.
Not a fan.
Interesting. True. I I do
It
think that
it
is
has
true.
advantages. I mean, you don't get any pre-echo because that's caused by a highly modulated groove next to a silent groove. Taking on the shape of the modulated groove,
Hmm.
which doesn't happen in metal mastering. So there are certain advantages to it, but I think the advantages are outweighed by the disadvantages.
Probably, and they're
Just
probably.
my opinion.
No, no. Well, I mean, there is a reason why others aren't doing it. I would suppose. So maybe some people, some labels are using it because they are the only ones, or at least among the few doing that. Maybe, I don't know. I mean, there are excellent stuff like, for example, Stockfish, but I do sense what you're talking about sometimes. So great.
Okay.
Okay, so let's try to dive in a little bit more in the technical part, even though I want more, if possible, a
Okay.
highlight of the processing of the signal, meaning from playback,
Okay.
let's say tape, all the way to the cutting head. A very
Okay.
interesting chain there.
Okay. Well, I'm not quite sure where to start.
I bet.
Uh, okay, so the tape gets put on the playback machine. It runs through the console, and you adjust levels and EQ if it needs it. I'm quick to say, don't mess with it. If it sounds great, leave it alone. But if it needs some help, then we try to give it some help. Um, Now, then that signal is transferred to the cutting electronics, and then to the cutting head on the lathe. I think maybe what you're asking, you had mentioned something about RIA and some of that.
Yeah, well,
I mean, that all
yeah,
happens
because
sort of automatically in the disc cutting electronics. That isn't done by me in the mastering, so to speak. I mean,
no, of course.
it happens automatically going through the cutting electronics. So,
No,
have I left anything out
I'm
here?
very fascinating. No, no, don't worry. I'm very fascinating from the low frequencies, because this is a huge debate among audiophiles, among in forums and things like that. So, is there a limitation of the lower register? Is it cut in mono? Is the RIAA curve enough to compensate? Illuminate us.
Oh, I see what you're asking. I see what you're asking. Yeah. Yeah, I think the RAA curve was chosen very wisely. Always doing something like that is a compromise. You know, um, but it allows you to get record stuff on the record and have it come back, relatively quiet. If you didn't have the high frequency boost, you'd be in the noise floor, and if you didn't roll off the bass, you'd have 5 or 10 minutes on the side instead of 15 or 20. So that's all done intentionally, and I think it was a good choice. They had several curves prior to the RAA, and they were experimenting with different things. And RAA is what got settled on worldwide, and I think it's a good compromise. Now, as far as
But
limitations, yes, there are
yeah,
limitations.
mm.
Go ahead.
No, no,
There are
there's a
limitations,
delay,
but
unfortunately.
yeah, I see it, hear it.
Mm.
Um, but the problems are all at very low frequencies. I mean, below 20 cycles. You can get 20 cycles on the record. Um, if it's real percussive stuff, that can be a problem in terms of its skipping. I can get it on the record. You might not be able to play it back. But I throw out this example when people ask me that. I don't know if you've heard the mastering of Blade Runner that I did for Audiophile, the
I
soundtrack
haven't.
from the movie. That has
The new
25
one.
cycle bass on it. I'm sorry?
The new one.
Yeah,
The
the
new
one
Blade
the
Runner.
one that I did, it was quite a few years ago, actually. It was maybe 2012, 13, 14, I don't somewhere
Okay.
in there, I think. But that's got really low bass on it, and sometimes at fairly high amplitude. Although it's not like drum beat bass; it's more like steady, synthesizer kind of
Ooh.
bass.
Hmm. Cool. Obviously, I'm purchasing it immediately after this session. But
Okay.
is it true that you have to, like, as a compromise, cut in mono sometimes still today, or that's not happening anymore?
Well, okay. Are you talking about using like a low
Low.
frequency crossover
Yes.
that combines the channels to
Yes.
mono? I often do that, but I always keep it below 70 cycles. So,
Okay.
it's 6 dB per octave. So there's not a whole lot of combine happening. And it's more to keep it so that it'll play, on less than audiophile systems. Um, I don't really filter the bass. A lot of people did that back in the day. And, yeah, and I've heard stuff that's been crossed over all the way up to like 700 cycles, which is the highest position on most of them. And
Oh,
I don't see any need to ever do that.
okay. That's good.
Does that answer the question?
We can hear that actually, I think, but you never know. It's we're also asking questions in general, not just your
Mhm.
work, obviously. Mainly
Okay.
focused on your work, but you have experience and you have been in contact with people, so you know how things have been in the past and been done in the past and doing now.
Right.
They well, actually, I have the same question for the higher frequencies. Is
Okay.
there a roll off today? Are we cutting a lot of stuff or not that much in the end? There's
At
also the
very high
problem of
frequencies.
sibilance. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, my system goes up to 100 kilohertz. The audio about 175 kilohertz actually the audio chain. Now that doesn't mean that the cutter head responds up there. The cutter head is pretty flat up to 20 kilohertz and then rolls off after that. Um, but you do have to impose some kind of it's sort of dynamic filtering for things like vocal sibilance and excessive, and I mean excessive cymbals, the kind of stuff that you mostly find on rap and disco music, not so much pop music or classical. Um, and it depends from program to program what you have to do. I mean, you can look at on the disc cutting electronics. There are meters that indicate how much current is being drawn by the cutter head,
Mm,
from the power amplifiers,
yeah.
and you can tell when that gets too high, it's not going to play back properly. So it's necessary to high frequency limit to keep that in bounds.
Do you think that this, let's say, round, more supple, more euphonic upper frequencies help bring people closer to vinyl? Is it making more easier to listen? What is your take on that?
Oh, not quite sure how to answer that. I I mean, yes, I think that, but I'm not sure that it's because of anything that I'm imposing. I don't know quite how
Mm,
to explain it. I mean, I explained when I gave a talk at Expana that there is a certain artifact to vinyl. The audiophiles don't want to hear that. They want to think that it's perfect and digital is all full of problems. Well, they both have their own, pros and cons.
absolutely.
But yeah, I think what most people like about vinyl is the warmth of it, and some of that is sort of an artifact of the whole process.
Mm.
Don't know how else to put it, but I love vinyl,
Is
and that's what I listen to at home when I'm listening seriously.
oh, that's interesting. Thank you for sharing that.
Oh yeah,
Is
I
the,
I only use CDs for like playing background music at parties.
okay? That's clear now. No, no, I understand. But well, do you know if this is done also in digital? If roll off or cutting some frequencies here and there, and for creating the digital masters?
I'm sure it
I,
is, but I can't really answer that. I mean,
okay, okay,
what
no,
again, when you get into rap and dance music, there's so much excessive high end on that. I'm sure that in mastering, other people are pulling that down a little bit from the way it's
mm,
originally mixed,
okay.
but just guessing.
Let's pass to another topic, which is also highly debated: the 33 RPM versus 45 RPM, which
Hmm.
clearly brings some benefits. This is undoubtable. But I don't know. Can you
Clearly.
elaborate a little bit on that? What's your take also on this?
Sure. 45 RPM. Okay. Problems in playback are all due to the curvature of the groove. And that means the higher the frequency, the closer together the wiggles are, and the higher the amplitude, the more drastic the curves are. So if you can take the same program and cut it at 45 RPM, it spreads that curvature out and makes it easier to track. So yes, and we're talking about, I think it's 35% is the sort of the speed difference between 33 and 45. So it's reducing the curvature by that amount.
Hmm.
And so yeah, on certain program material, it's noticeable. It's very noticeable. Okay, that having been said, I really don't care for 45s because of having to flip the sides over all the time. I just it breaks up the listening
I
experience
agree.
for me. It destroys
I
the
agree.
flow. So again, compromise. I mean, I guess if you want ultimate sonics, yeah, 45. But if you want just an enjoyable experience, listening to a phonograph record, I usually pick 33.
I must admit that I have to agree. I also said this in a dedicated episode. People hated me for it. But for example, the fantastic box set of the Doors, I love it. But every time you reach out for it, you're gonna have to get up after every 7 or 8 minutes. It's a little too
Yeah,
much.
for me, it just destroys the flow. I mean, the songs were sequenced with a specific timing in between songs,
True.
intended, and you have to kind of throw that out the window to put it on 45 sides.
True. Okay, another important aspect I wanted to ask you, which was unfortunately somehow again debated on another video. Microframer thought I was accusing you guys of using it. No, I'm talking about analog versus digital delay.
Okay.
I know that you guys don't have digital delay, but in the past, that was shocking. We did have that. And I mean, well, you tell us a little bit about it. I don't want to
Well,
spoil anything.
oh no, 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 no. It's a very good point, and I'm happy to put my 2 cents worth in, as we say.
Thanks.
Um, in let's see, how do I start? Okay, back when the phonograph record went away, the first time, like in the like 1990, I guess, a lot of people built mastering consoles for doing digital, and they didn't put the provision in to have a program chain and a preview chain. Preview being what feeds a computer in the cutting lathe that adjusts the groove spacing. When the music's loud, it spreads the grooves farther apart. When the music gets quiet, it closes them down, allows you to get more time or more volume or both on the record. Okay, when vinyl started to come back in again in the mid 90s, and particularly in the mid 2000s, people had all these consoles that didn't have preview, so they would have to take a tape machine that didn't have a preview head on it and run it through a digital delay, and you would use the signal off the tape to feed the computer, and then delayed signal to feed the cutting electronics in the cutting head. And it's basically like you might as well be doing it from a digital file, because it has the same.
Exactly.
Yeah, you know, you're doing the brick wall filtering and the reconstruction filter and all of that stuff, you know, in the digital delay. So yeah, and you know, people said, well, wouldn't there be less wow and flutter? And it's like having the tape go around one more or two more loops. That I don't see, and I've made the measurements. It doesn't increase wow and flutter. So yeah, my system's all analog, and I don't go through any digital delays. And the only time I ever use a digital delay is if I'm mastering from a CD.
Obviously. So you can confirm that the digital delay is going on the record when used, when adopted.
Absolutely, yeah. The signal's going through
Because
it.
people say, no, that's not true. And I don't know how to say
It is
this
true.
anymore. Okay,
Yeah, I
thank
got
you.
into an argument with a guy online about this who didn't have a clue what he was talking about, but he kept saying, he said that the VMS 80 lathe had a digital delay built into it, so that everything went through a digital delay when you cut on a VMS 80. Not true. It has a computer, which is digital. The audio, the computer isn't in the audio. It's machine control. It's just
Of
driving a
course.
motor that moves the cutter head across the disc.
For more precision. Yes, of course.
Yeah.
Okay. That's a very important point. I'm happy we discussed
It
about that.
is.
Oh,
I'm glad you're bringing these points up. Guido, this is why I was willing to do this interview, because your questions were great.
well,
You know, I
thank
think
you.
I
But
initially
please,
either I said no or I said I wasn't that interested or something. And then
no,
you
no,
said,
you
"Can I
did it.
send you my questions?" And yeah, let's do it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And
You're most
please
welcome.
jump in if you want to add anything.
Okay.
We need more information. Absolutely.
All right.
I'm the
So far, so
first
good.
one. I'm the first ignorant, really. Um, uh, I was wondering, since there's this fantastic little recommendation on the Coherent Audio site where you say that you're completely against loudness and you're not going to master things, squishing everything. So,
Right.
can you tell us a little bit? How are things done when you have to master high res or DSD files? Even though I understand you don't do that much in the end. Clearly, you're mainly focused on vinyl ultimately.
Yeah. My the SACDs and the high res download and streaming stuff is all done from files that I create when I cut the phonograph record. So it's exactly the same EQ and everything
Okay.
that went on the vinyl. Um, so, but that's what I do. You know, there are so many people doing digital mastering, and it's, you know, the whole idea is to make everything sound the same volume on your playback medium. You know,
Mm.
originally it was the iPod, and then it was, well, actually originally it was on CD changers. You know, so that you'd have, you remember the old carousels where you'd have 5 CDs in there, and
I
so you
had
wanted
one.
every CD to sound the same volume. You know, you didn't want one to sound 6 or 8 dB lower, which is what it would be if it wasn't digitally compressed. Which is, you know, so, and then came the iPod, and then all the other personal, you know, listening things, and you know, and computers. And so with, especially with iTunes and Spotify and all that, they want everything to basically be the same volume. And so they put 6 to 8 dB of digital compression on everything. And it doesn't matter whether it's jazz or classical, it's done to everything,
Really?
really.
I, I was expecting at least a little less on jazz and classical music.
Oh,
Usually,
maybe a
that's
couple
the
of dB,
narrative.
but it's still it's still
It's so
digitally
high.
compressed.
So, at least in your experience, when you're cutting vinyl from digital, are there is there the full spectrum in that case, or is it just the same process and in the end? I mean, do you
It's
have to
pretty much the
adjust?
same process. I mean, whatever the bandwidth is on the CD, you're putting onto the vinyl. except for, maybe down below 20 cycles. There's a little bit more low bass on a digital file. But yeah, that's about it. Did I answer the question?
Yes, yes. So actually, I was thinking also in reverse. When you or anybody else does a master for a super audio CD, is there some cutting there in the lower and upper register? I mixed up before.
No,
Sorry.
no, I wouldn't say so. No.
Okay, that's good. At least that's good. Um, I was also thinking about the percentages. If you have an idea of CD, super audio CD, meaning DSD, liquid mastering against tape, vinyl. I
Oh,
imagine vinyl is
you mean for me?
the. Yes, yes.
What I see? Oh,
How
it's
much?
funny.
Yes.
It's totally flip flopped in the 13 years, 14 years I've been operating my business now. When I first started, I was probably doing 30 to 40% from analog tape and 60% or something like that. Digital from digital
Hmm.
files, some from CDRs back in the first days that I opened. Very little of that anymore. It's mostly high res digital if it's digital. But it's all flip flop now. I mean, I'm doing so much. When you look at all the stuff that I'm doing for Blue Note, there's two different series, the Tone Poets and the Classics. All of the stuff that I'm doing for thanks. All of the stuff that I'm doing for Concord Craft, you know, all of that's from original analog tapes.
I know.
And then the
Fantastic.
Rhino high fidelity series is all from original analog tapes. So
That's my
I got a
favorite.
lot of tapes in my room.
I bet. I bet.
Yeah,
Fantastic.
and at
No,
this
well,
point, maybe 15% is digital.
that's good. But there
Yeah.
are some times where there's more digital. Let's say not after the vinyl resurgence, I bet, or yes, instead there are some moments.
Even after the vinyl resurgence, people were doing a lot of stuff from digital in the early
Okay.
days of that. Yeah.
So, do you mainly focus now on we could call it audiophile mastering, or do you accept even, let's say, normal projects?
Oh, well, that's an interesting question. I accept just about anything, as long as it isn't an MP3 or something really bad like that. But but I do. Most of that is for the smaller labels. And unfortunately, I'm so busy doing all of the work that I just mentioned that I'm taking very few of those projects anymore.
Hmm.
I started turning away business around 2017, and I'm still turning business away. And I don't want to be that way. I'd love to be doing everything for everybody, but I got to sleep sometime.
Yes, please do.
Thank
Obviously,
you.
we want these fantastic records. No, well, I do want to take a minute, I mean, a few seconds, because I said this before, it was off camera, but I do really. Uh, it's not for flattering. I mean, your work is just incredible. I mean, the records, in my opinion, the top records now out there that we are having these fantastic reissues are cut from you, and they're astonishing. I mean, your hand, your artisanal way of doing things, and clearly also your fantastic new set, which we will talk briefly about afterwards. Your analog all tube setup.
Right.
Congratulations! I had to say this.
Well, thank you, Guido. I really appreciate that.
Thank you for what you do. Um, can you give us an idea? I know it's difficult because you're focused on your work, but what are the main differences from mass-produced vinyl mastering and what we call audiophile, or simply
Oh, no,
high
that's a great
quality?
question. That's a great
Mm,
question. I'm very happy to answer that. Back in the 70s, pressings were barely acceptable as far as I was
mm,
concerned. 60s and 70s. I mean, I started in 72, but I was collecting records in the 60s. And, it was not unusual to have to take a record back a couple of times to get a good one into a record store. And when everything was mass produced, the quality kind of went out the window. I mean, you couldn't get a pressing from three different pressing plants of the same material. The lacquers were cut successively, but exactly the same way. When I would master for Columbia, you'd cut 2 sets of masters for the Santa Maria, California plant, 2 sets for the Terre Haute, Indiana plant, and 2 sets for the Pittman, New Jersey plant. They were all cut at the same time, one right after the other, all the same EQ, same everything, same batch of lacquers probably. You get pressings back from the 3 plants and they all sounded different. You know? Okay. So
Incredible.
that, I think, explains the biggest part of the mass-produced problem. So when people started doing audiophile releases in the mid 70s, the mid to late 70s, so much more care was taken at every step along the way. The mastering, the processing, the press, processing, I mean, the plating,
Yeah.
the pressing. It was night and day different. There's a guy, I won't even mention his name and give him credit, but he sells these super high priced $300, $400, $500, $600, mass produced records, that he's handpicked, and he bashes my work. He's made a career of bashing my work. And to me, the whole thing is just so unbelievable that people buy into it, I like to say that he puts out the cream of the crop of mass-produced garbage.
Well put. I don't know who that is. I have maybe an idea, but maybe afterwards
we can talk about it off camera.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, since you recently, let's say, created this new setup for all tube, from what I understand, for your mastering choices and work, maybe you can give us an idea of the differences between solid state, let's say, and what you're using now. The main differences.
So yeah, it started to get used recently, but the whole process went back to 2005 is when I started building the system.
Wow.
So yeah, there's a 17-minute video on YouTube that you can watch if you're curious about that. Just go to Cohearent with the HEAR spelling. Records.
I'll put the link below in the video description.
Oh, wonderful. Okay.
Very cool.
Right. Thank you so much. Thank you.
No problem.
Anyway, it's got something like 80,000 hits now, which shocked me. I would have been happy to get 1,000 hits. I couldn't believe it. So anyway, and that helped a lot selling the first record because that was the only promotion we did for Kirsten Edkins' record. So anyway, I spent a lot of time building the system. Great. Thank you. Thank you. So I spent a lot of time building the system, years building the system. I had no idea it was going to take that long. And I was about ready to start recording in 2017. But then I thought, well, if I start recording now and I start putting records, or tapes on the shelf and I can't cut them, I'm going to wind up with a backlog and that's not going to be good. So I decided to wait until I had the disc cutting system finished. And that took another 3 years. So I got that finished just as COVID hit in 2020. So perfect. Bad timing. Yeah. So 2 things happened in the course of that. The studio that I was going to be taking my gear to record, and they were actually going to let me keep it there so I wouldn't have to schlep it back and forth. They went out of business during COVID, shut down, gone, and sold off all their equipment, just gone. So that left me without a place to record. And that was when I saw this website by a guy named Rich Capeless, rvglegacy.org. Recommend anybody interested in old time jazz, read up on that. So it talks about Rudy Van Gelder's studio in Hackensack, New Jersey. And he put up the plan for the layout of the room. And I took a look at it and went, wow, that's just about the same size as my living room, dining room area in the house. So I showed it to my wife and she said, hey, let's convert the living room, dining room into a recording studio. So we went full speed ahead. And I really appreciate her support,
You have the
and
best
help
wife.
with doing that.
The best wife, absolutely.
She's awesome.
And in fact, you wrote that, I think, on the website or somewhere, maybe on the records. I don't remember this, that you were thanking for this communal intent. Thanks to your wife. Something else I've been discussing on a recent video.
Let's go back to that though at some point, because I didn't really get into the differences in the sound. But
that's
go ahead.
Right. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm
No, no,
just
no. It's
set
all
for all
right. I
these
just want to make
questions.
sure we
No,
touch everything that you
no,
were
no,
starting
no.
to.
You're right. I'm sorry. Forgive me. Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, no, that's fine. So it's a very different sound when you consider the whole chain. I haven't really broken it down too much into pieces, if you know what I mean, because I look at the whole thing as a whole with the idea of sort of creating a vintage sound with modern music. That was the concept. Um, and it's kind of hard to quantify what changes the sound where in terms of, it's well, you probably are aware that in 2020, just kind of for a lark, I cut the War greatest hits when it came in with my tube
Hmm.
cutting electronics only. So it was just the cutting rack with the power amplifiers and the RAA and all of that. Um, just to see how it would sound. And I was thrilled with the way it sounded. And we put it out there and didn't say anything to anybody. It was for Record
Aha.
Store Day 2020. And about 2 years later, I let it drop that, by the way, that was cut with my tube rig because my record hadn't even been released yet. So people were saying, well, we're really anxious to hear how your system sounds. I said, well, if you want to hear the disc cutting part of it, you can buy this
It's
record.
already there.
And suddenly it sold out. So
I
I guess
bet.
there was a lot of interest. But, I would say
Absolutely.
that you know, it's such a cliche, but there is a little bit of a warmer sound to tubes. And it's not just that they glow and put off heat. I've heard that joke. But
I bet.
the top end's a little sweet. The bottom end has got a lot of slam to it, but it's not quite the same as my Class A solid state system. I'm happy to go on record and say I actually think my Class A solid state system is a little more accurate in terms of giving you exactly what's on the tape. But I love the sound of the tube system. And I think and that's why I'm basically saving it for my projects. I'm not using it for other people's projects. And I'm not going to be doing reissues or anything like that. So, or at least not planning to. Uh, People have asked me, but
Oh, okay. So, only for your for the coherent audio records, you've been using that.
exactly.
Oh,
That's all
okay.
it's getting
I
used
didn't know
for.
that. I didn't know that.
So,
Oh,
yeah.
okay. Cool. Cool. Very
Well, with
envious.
that one exception of the uh,
Yeah.
the Rhino War greatest hits. And it's the single record one that's pressed on kind of a gold swirled vinyl because there's a two record war set that came out greatest hits that came out about the same time. That's not my mastering. So
I know. It just recently came out. I think the double
no
one.
20. Oh, the double one. No, actually it's been out for at least a year, maybe longer,
Okay.
but
Yeah.
that created some confusion.
I got the other one. I have it. I knew there was something going around that, and the single one would have been better. Great. I'm
Right.
happy about that. Okay. Well, thank you for that. I just wanted to focus a minute on the loudness war, so-called loudness war,
Sure.
meaning that at least that's my perception, and I shared this in a recent video. That is one of the reasons why I think it's worthwhile to purchase vinyl, because the mastering is a little more softer. It's less compressed.
Right.
Is that true?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, that having been said, there is stuff that's mastered from pre-mastered digital that's really compressed. And
I bet.
obviously
I
I
bet.
have no control over that. A lot of
Mm-mm-mm.
the newer releases, they provide digital files. You know, I used to do a lot of work with a guy named Joe Gastwork, and we were kind of a tag team because people would go to him for the CD and the digital streaming and download stuff, and then he would send the files to me for cutting. And Joe was an old cutting engineer from the Sony days, and he knows how much better it sounds when it's not compressed to death. And so he would create a file for me that didn't have all the digital compression that he was doing for the digital releases. And I wish more people would do that. And I've suggested it to people. Haven't seen it happen too much. He was the main guy that I thank for doing that.
Cool. Um, I don't know, but do you sense, because your ear is trained, that let's say, just let's call them normal releases, normal quality releases, Do you sense a lot of compression? Let's say, I don't know, though, I don't want to make it say any names, not just to not discriminate anyone, but let's just say normal releases that you find on Amazon, not high quality audiophile releases. Do you
Yeah,
sense a lot of compression there?
most of it has a lot of compression on it. Yeah,
Okay.
I would say it's just
Okay.
it's the audiophile stuff. And you touched on something there that I think is really true. I think a lot of people are buying audiophile releases today because it's the only way they can get the material without all the compression. Now, the audiophile labels are also putting them out usually for download and streaming, not on Spotify because they'll compress it themselves. But if you go to like Qobuz, who's releasing the Kirsten Edkins that I did, those files sound wonderful. There was a review, I could send it to you if you want, that where a guy was actually comparing
Thank you.
the Spotify and the Qobuz and the vinyl, and I think he nailed it. So
Cool. Absolutely. Yes. Please send it. It's fascinating. I mean, it's something that a lot of people don't even imagine. And once again, I think we have to put that out and spread the word.
exactly, I'm glad you're doing it.
I just want to go back a second when we were talking about the high frequencies in the mastering. When you receive a high res file, I mean a really high res file with a huge spectrum of frequencies, even if it's noise, I mean going really up like 40, 50, 60 kilohertz, is that possible to put on vinyl, or it's just you're not going to be able to play that back?
Well, there's so little music over
It's
25
more, it's
kilohertz.
noise.
It's hardly worth talking about. The cutter head is going to roll it off naturally. It's a
Oh,
mechanical
okay.
transducer. You're asking it basically to produce 20 to 20,000 cycles. That's a wide range for a single transducer. Think of a speaker. How many full range speakers are there? There's a few, but they're very, very few and far between. They're usually
True.
8 inches in diameter, and they don't really produce low bass. So if you want to produce the full 20 to 20 kilohertz spectrum, doing it with a single transducer like a cutter head is difficult.
I bet. Another thing I wanted to ask, and here you have to be honest because you're part of it.
I'll be honest.
See, since we are living what I called a new analog age, the current reissues, do you think they are better than the originals? Clearly not in every case, but in most cases, what do you think?
Yes, I would have to say they are. I'm not saying all of them, but I can name the guys, Bernie Grunman, um, Ryan Smith, and myself. And who am I leaving out? There's a couple of other people that are doing some very, very good work on audiophile releases, and yeah, I think they blow the originals away.
Yeah, because from
I mean,
what
for
I
one thing, the
understand,
equipment has improved. The equipment is better than it was in those
exactly.
days. And I know my system is because it was custom built. It's class A, solid state, transformerless from tape head to cutter head. And I don't think anybody else has that. But there are a lot of systems that have been really tweaked up to sound a lot better than the old systems back in the 70s. And and if you get an engineer who's not too heavy-handed or knows how to properly twist the knobs, I think you're going to wind up with a release that sounds better than the original. Oh,
Exactly.
Chris
Also,
Chris Bellman, forgot Chris. He does
yeah,
great work
true.
too. He's a friend,
No,
personal friend.
no, also because, correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, back in the days, let's say 60s, 70s, for example, jazz recordings, uh, they had to cut off a lot of frequencies because people had, let's say, crappy playback systems.
Exactly.
So,
That's exactly
so
right.
that's also, now we're benefiting of all this technology and we can put back a lot of the missing spectrum.
Right. That was probably over by the late 60s, though. But yeah,
Okay,
you in the 50s for sure. There were heavy
in the
limitations
50s. Okay,
on what you could put on the record and not have it skip or distort or, in playback.
perfect. Thank you. A difficult question. What is missing today in in the record production in general? What you think compared to your experience to the past?
I don't find much missing. What kinds of things were you thinking?
I don't know. I mean,
You need
if
to give me a prompt here.
um in relation to the manufacturing process, let's say, restrain a little bit, not the music, okay, the manufacturing
Okay.
process, like for example pressing, it
Yes.
seems prehistoric. Don't you think we should update that technology there?
Well, there's been a lot of improvements in that too
Mm.
that people aren't aware of.
Oh,
The
okay,
vinyl
tell us.
compound, the vinyl compound that we're using today is way better, I think, than what was around in the 60s. Um, and it was a transitional thing where there were some problems. In the United States, they required that lead be removed from vinyl. You would say, lead? Why would there be lead in vinyl? It's a lubricant. It was to allow the stamper and the record to separate. When you open the press, it wouldn't stick, and
Yes.
it also allowed the vinyl to flow, from because it flows from the puck or whatever you want to call it in the center, biscuit, to the outside. And
Yes.
so that aided. Okay. So I think it was around 1990, 1995, somewhere in there, the Environmental Protection Agency said, hey, you can't put lead in vinyl anymore. So for years, I'd say about a 5-year period there were some problems because they were trying all kinds of different other materials to correct that, to be able to have that advantage of the lead without it actually being lead. And so they finally got that all straightened out, and that's really improved things. Stampers used to
Mm.
be nickel, as they are today, but then they would plate them with an additional layer of chrome, which made them last
Hmm.
longer, and that degraded the sound
Really?
quality. And so, yeah,
Aha.
these $600 originals that this guy's selling, they're all made with chrome stampers, so they're automatically missing some detail there. So there's a lot of things like that. And they're making new record presses, which are sort of clones of the old ones. There's a company making copies of the SMT, which is my favorite press, which was made in Nashville, USA. And then also the Tulex Alpha presses that were made in Sweden, I think. And so there's kind of new clones coming online. So it is kind of nice to have new stuff rather than having to keep fixing the old stuff.
No, of course, of course. Okay, I don't want to take too much time. I just want to know if there's something besides these fantastic releases that we have from Coherent Audio. I'm trying to put this in the picture.
Thank you for putting those up.
I No, they're fantastic.
Thank you.
they auto promote themselves. Tell us if there's something else coming
Well,
up.
we're talking to 2 or 3 artists right now. Well, 3 actually, about doing our next project. There's a couple of interesting problems. First of all, you have to find an artist who's not signed to a label
Mm.
if they're going to be the lead artist. Like um, we had to put, Gerald Clayton Curtis on both albums, courtesy of Blue Note, because he had to get permission because he's a sideman on it, and that's okay. But I couldn't do a Gerald Clayton album if I wanted to, as the
Mm.
as the lead artist because he's signed to Blue Note, and so you have to find artists that aren't signed to a major label, and you have to find an artist who can find the time to get into the studio to do the record because a lot of them are touring a lot. And on both records, we started talking. Anthony agreed to do the record that we did in June in January. So it took 6 months to get those 4 guys with their schedules in the studio.
Mm.
And it was the same thing. We had to wait to get Gerald for Kirsten's record because he had been out on the road in Europe with Charles Lloyd. As a matter of fact, we recorded the album 2 days after he got back from Europe. So, yeah.
Well, again, congratulations on that. We hope many others are coming up.
By the way,
Well,
I want to make a
okay,
shout out
yeah,
to another
sure.
Italian. There's a guy
Mm.
in Italy, in Bologna, I think you pronounce it.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly. Bologna.
Roberto Borbolini is his name, And he is one of the few guys in the world rebuilding Neumann cutter heads. And he just rebuilt one for me, and it's wonderful. So I want to
Really?
thank him, and I want to let people in the cutting industry who maybe don't know about him that he's the guy to go to.
Well, that's like half an hour of train from me, so I'll try and go and visit him. Thank you for
Yeah,
sharing
yeah, that
that.
would be great. He's a great guy. So
Oh,
very
cool, great,
very easy to communicate with, and it was just it was a wonderful experience dealing with him.
fantastic. Thanks, thank you again. Well, and thank you especially for your time. Really, Kevin, thank
You're
you so
most
much.
welcome. Well,
What else
we've
can I
touched on
say?
so many things that have not been asked that I'd like to see out there. So I'll leave that up to you to get your video out to people. But yeah, no,
Perfect.
I'm very happy to do this.
Thank you.
You
Thank
want
you
to do
again.
another one down the road? I'm happy to do that too.
Absolutely. We're in for it. Thank you again, Kevin.
You're most welcome.
Bye-bye. Ciao.
Bye.
Thank you again. Well, guys, if you're enjoying my videos and you're enjoying my channel, please consider to subscribe by clicking the black and white logo here below. Also, don't forget to click the notification bell so you'll never miss an episode and you will become a true member of the analog community.